Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Make it square. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Jasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jamanatira Vanachadi. Jamanatira Vanachadi. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Gopijana Vallabha Girivardhari. Jasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jamunatira Vanachadi. Jamunatira Vanachadi. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Vishnupad Paramahamsa Hariva Jakacharya Astatasi Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnavarind Ki Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Gora Premanandi. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Beginning a new chapter, Canto 11, Chapter 11, text number 1. And the way we're going to begin is read the chapter summary, and then we'll read Bhaktisiddhanta's chapter summary, and then we'll read text 1. from the BBT publication. In this chapter, Lord Sri Krishna describes to Uddhava the difference between conditioned and liberated living entities, the characteristics of a saintly person, and the different aspects of the practice of devotional service. Paragraph. It's a long paragraph. In the previous chapter, Uddhava had presented questions regarding conditioned and liberated souls. In his replies, the Almighty Lord Sri Krishna states that although the spirit soul is part and parcel of the Supreme Personality Godhead, on account of his infinitesimal nature, he falls into contact with the material energy, which causes him to accept the covering designations of the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. Thus, the soul has been bound up since time immemorial. But when he achieves the shelter of pure devotional service, he becomes designated as eternally liberated. Catch that one? The Nityabhada just changes designation. He's all of a sudden eternally liberated. Transcendental knowledge is therefore the cause of the living entity's liberation, and ignorance is the cause of his bondage. Both knowledge and ignorance are products produced by the Maya energy of Lord Sri Krishna and are his eternal potencies. The living entities who become attracted to the modes of material nature are bewildered by false ego, which causes them to see themselves as the enjoyers of misery, confusion, happiness, distress, danger, and so on. In this way, they meditate upon such states of being, although in the real or spiritual world, these things do not exist. Both the jiva, or individual soul, and the super soul reside within the same body. The difference between them is that the Almighty Supersoul, being fully cognizant, does not indulge in enjoying the fruits of the material work, but remains simply as a witness, whereas the infinitesimal conditioned jiva, being ignorant, suffers the consequences of his own work. The liberated jiva, in spite of being within a material body, because of the remaining reactions of his past activities, does not become disturbed by the happiness and suffering of the body. He sees such bodily experiences in the same way that a person who has just awakened from a dream sees his dream experiences. On the other hand, although the conditioned living entity is by nature not the enjoyer of the happiness and misery of the in a dream, imagines his dream experiences to be real. Just as the sun reflected upon water is not actually bound up in the water, and just as the air is not confined to some particular segment of the sky, similarly a detached person takes advantage of his broad outlook on the world to cut off all his doubts with the sword of appropriate renunciation, yukta vairagya. Since his life force, senses, mind, and intelligence have no tendency to fix themselves on sense objects, he remains liberated even while situated within the material body. Regardless of whether he is harassed or worshipped, he remains equipoised. He is therefore considered liberated. Even in this life, a liberated person has nothing to do with the piety and sin of this world, but rather sees everything equally. A self-satisfied sage does not praise or condemn anyone. He does not speak uselessly to anyone, and does not fix his mind on material things. Rather, he is always merged in meditation upon the Supreme Personality Godhead, so in the eyes of fools, he seems to be a speechless, crazy person. There's a whole other page here. Plus, even if someone has studied or even taught all the different Vedic literatures, If he has not developed pure attraction to the service of the personality of Godhead, he has accomplished nothing beyond his own labor. One should study only those scriptures in which the nature of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his enchanting pastimes, and the nectarian topics of his various incarnations are scientifically discussed, semicolon. Thus one gains the highest good fortune. However, by studying scriptures other than these, one simply acquires misfortune. Paragraph. With full determination, one should properly understand the identity of the soul and give up false identification with this material body. He may then offer his heart at the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord Sri Krishna, the reservoir of all love, and attain real peace. When the mind is carried away by the three modes of nature, it can no longer meditate properly on the transcendental supreme truth. After many lifetimes, faithful persons who have performed Vedic sacrifices for acquiring religiosity, economic development, and sense gratification, finally engage in hearing, chanting, and constantly thinking of the Supreme Lord's all-auspicious pastimes, which purify the entire universe. Such persons then achieve the association of a bona fide spiritual master and the saintly devotees. That's a little perplexing. When they become perfect, then they achieve the association of a devotee. It's a little perplexing. After that, by the mercy of the spiritual master, they begin to follow the paths set out by the standard authorities of spiritual life, the Mahajans, and become actually perfect in realization of their own true identity. Paragraph. Having heard instructions from Lord Krishna, Uddhava further desired to understand the characteristics of a factually saintly person and the different aspects of devotional practice. Lord Krishna replied that a real sadhu or Vaishnava is qualified with the following characteristics. It's a good list. He is merciful, non-envious, always truthful, self-controlled, faultless, magnanimous, gentle, clean, non-possessive, helpful to all, peaceful, in italics, dependent on Krishna alone, free from lust, devoid of material endeavor, steady, in control of the six enemies of the mind, moderate in eating, never bewildered, always respectful to others, never desirous of respect for himself, sober, compassionate, friendly, poetic, expert, and silent. The principal characteristic of a sadhu is that he takes shelter of Krishna alone. One who engages exclusively in Krishna's service and understands him as the limitless, indwelling Lord who comprises eternality, knowledge, and bliss is the topmost devotee. The practice of devotional service includes 64 kinds of activities. Among these are 1 through 6. Seeing, touching, worshipping, serving, glorifying, and offering obeisances to the deity of the Lord and his pure devotees. 7. Developing attachment for hearing the chanting of the Lord's qualities, pastimes, and so on. 8. Remaining always in meditation upon the Lord. 9. Offering everything one acquires to the Lord. 10. Accepting oneself to be the Lord's servant. 11. Offering the Lord one's heart and soul. 12. Engaging in glorification of the Lord's birth and activities. 13. Observing holidays related to the Lord. 14. Performing festivals in the Lord's temple in the company of other devotees and with music, singing, and dancing. 15. Celebrating all varieties of yearly functions. 16. Offering foodstuffs to the Lord. 17. Taking initiation according to the Vedas and Tantras. 18. Taking vows related to the Lord. 19. Being eager to establish deities of the Lord. 20. Endeavoring either alone or in association with others in constructing for the service of the Lord vegetable and flower gardens, temples, cities, and so on. 21. humbly cleansing the temple of the Lord, and 22, rendering service to the Lord's house by painting it, washing it with water, and decorating it with auspicious designs. Paragraph. After this, the process of worshiping the deity of the Supreme Lord is described in brief. It's a long chapter. And Bhaktisiddhanta's summary of the chapter is even longer. Yes, sir. The first introductory sentence is quite the same. In this chapter, Lord Krishna describes to Uddhava the difference between conditioned and liberated living entities, the characteristics of a saintly person, and the various limbs of devotional service. Paragraph. In the previous chapter, Uddhava had inquired about the difference between conditioned and liberated souls. In his reply, the supremely cognizant Sri Krishna states that although the spirit soul is his part and parcel, on account of his infinitesimal nature, he comes in contact with the material energy, which causes him to accept covering designations of the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. Thus he has been bound up since time immemorial. But when the spirit soul cultivates spiritual knowledge and achieves the shelter of devotional service, he becomes designated as eternally liberated. Paragraph. Therefore, transcendental knowledge is the cause of the living entity's liberation, and ignorance is the cause of his bondage. Both knowledge and ignorance are products of the illusory energy of Lord Sri Krishna, and thus are his eternal potencies. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? The living entities who are captivated by the three modes of material nature are bewildered by false ego, which causes them to see themselves as the enjoyers of misery's illusion, happiness, distress, danger, and so on. Thus, they remain absorbed in thoughts of such things, although they have no existence in the spiritual world. Means those things, not the souls. Paragraph. Both the individual spirit and the supersoul reside within the same body. Paragraph. The difference between the two is that the supersoul, being fully cognizant, does not indulge in enjoying the fruits of actions, but rather remains as a witness, whereas the infinitesimal conditioned soul, being ignorant, suffers the consequences of his own actions. The liberated soul, in spite of being within a material body, because of the remaining reactions of his past activities, does not become disturbed by the happiness and suffering of the body. This is almost word for word the same. So I think I'm going to skip the rest of it, especially that long list of the items of bhakti. Okay, so now we're going to text 1 and the BBT translation. The Supreme Personality Godhead said, "My dear Uddhava, due to the influence of these material modes of nature, which are under my control, the living entity is sometimes designated as conditioned and sometimes as liberated. In fact, however, the soul is never really bound up or liberated, since I am the Supreme Lord of Maya, which is the cause of the modes of nature. I also am never to be considered liberated or in bondage." And the translation by Bhaktisiddhanta. The Supreme Lord said, "My dear Uddhava, the three modes of material nature work under my control, sometimes designating the living entities as conditioned and sometimes granting them liberation. Truthfully, the living entities are never really conditioned or liberated, just as I remain unchanged as the Supreme Absolute Truth. the master of all potencies. Okay, now comes another really long purport. Long purport. BBT purport. In this chapter, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, explains the different characteristics of conditioned and liberated life, the symptoms by which one can recognize saintly persons, and the various processes of devotional service to the Lord. In the previous chapter, Uddhava inquired from the Lord how conditioned and liberated life, says, are possible. I guess conditioned life and liberated life are possible. Okay. The Lord now replies that Uddhava's question is somewhat superficial, since the pure spirit soul is never entangled in the material energy of the Lord. Wait a minute. Sure feels like it. The living entity imagines a false connection within the three modes of nature and accepts the material body as the self. The living entity therefore suffers the consequences of his own imagination, just as one suffers the illusory activities of a dream. This does not indicate that the material world is illusory in the sense that it is non-existent. The material world is certainly real, being the potency of the personality of Godhead, and the living entity, being the superior potency of God, is also real. But the living entity's dream of being part and parcel of the material world is an illusion that drags him into the contradictory state called material conditioned life. The living entity is never actually baddha, or bound up, since he merely imagines a false connection with the material world. It sounds like, depends on how you look at it, kind of speak. I mean, there is the term nityabadha, but here the statement is, living entity is actually never baddha. And the living entity is never actually liberated, for that matter. Since he merely imagines a false connection with the material world. Paragraph, let's see if that's elaborated. Because there is ultimately no permanent connection between the living entity and matter, there is no actual liberation. So there's no nityasiddhas either, or becoming liberated. The living entity, being eternally transcendental to the inferior material energy of the Lord, is eternally liberated. Okay, there's no actual liberation, but he's eternally liberated. Means he doesn't become liberated, but is eternally liberated. Sure doesn't feel like it. Lord Krishna reveals that, in one sense, the living entity is factually not bound up and thus cannot be liberated or become liberated. But in another sense, the term bondage and liberation can be conveniently applied to indicate the particular situation of the individual soul, who is the marginal potency of the Lord. Now that makes sense. Although the individual soul is never actually bound to matter, he suffers the reactions of material nature because of false identification, and thus the term baddha, or bound up, may be used to indicate the nature of the living entity's experience within the inferior energy of the Lord. Since baddha describes a false situation, freedom from such a false situation may also be described as moksha or liberation. Therefore, the term bondage and liberation are acceptable if one understands that such terms only refer to temporary situations created by illusion and do not refer to the ultimate nature of the living entity. Fair enough. In this verse, Lord Krishna states, Gunasya maya mulatvatna me moksho na bandhanam. The terms liberation and bondage can never be applied to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, since He is the Absolute Truth and the Supreme Controller of everything. Lord Krishna is eternally the Supreme Transcendental Entity, and He can never be bound by illusion. It is the duty of the illusory potency of the Personality of Godhead to attract living entities to ignorance by creating a false impression of a blissful existence separate from Lord Krishna. The illusory conception of existence apart from the Personality of Godhead is called Maya, or material illusion. Since Lord Krishna is the Supreme Absolute Controller of Maya, there is no possibility that Maya could have any influence over the Personality of Godhead. Thus, the term bandhanam, or bondage, cannot be applied to the eternal, blissful, and omniscient Personality of Godhead. The term moksha, or liberation, quote unquote, indicating freedom from bandhana, is equally irrelevant to the Lord. A whole lot more. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has commented on this verse as follows. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is endowed with great spiritual potencies because of mundane connection. The conditioned soul imagines that the Absolute Truth is devoid of variegated spiritual potencies by which he may enjoy blissful life. Although the living entity is the spiritual potency of the Lord, he is presently situated in inferior illusory potency, and by engaging in mental speculation, he becomes bound in conditioned life. Liberation means that the living entity should transfer himself to the spiritual potency, which can be divided into three categories: Hladini, potency of bliss; Sandhini, the potency of spiritual existence; Samvit, the potency of omniscience. Since the Personality of Godhead is eternally endowed with a pure existence of bliss and knowledge, he is never conditioned or liberated. The living entity, however, being entangled in the Lord's material potency, is sometimes conditioned and sometimes liberated. Two more paragraphs. The neutral, here we go, the fall of the jiva. The neutral, original state of the three modes of material nature is called Maya. When the three modes of nature interact, one of them will become powerful, subordinating the other two modes until another mode becomes prominent. In this way, the three can be distinguished in their variety of manifestation. Although the threefold material potency expands from the Personality of Godhead, the Lord Himself, in His personal form, is the actual abode of the three spiritual potencies, namely eternality, bliss, and knowledge. If one desires to become free from the entanglement of conditioned life within the material sky, called the kingdom of Maya, one must come to the spiritual sky wherein the living entities are filled with bliss, possess eternal spiritual bodies, and engage in the loving devotional service of the Lord. By developing one's eternal spiritual form in the loving service of the Lord, one immediately transcends the duality of conditioned life and impersonal liberation, and can directly experience the spiritual potencies of the Lord. At that time, there is no possibility of false identification with the material world. And the final paragraph. Realizing oneself to be eternal spirit soul, the living entity can understand that he is never truly connected to matter, because he is part of the superior energy of the Lord. Therefore, both material bondage and liberation are ultimately meaningless within the reality of the spiritual sky. The living entity is the marginal potency of the Lord and should exercise his free will to engage in the pure devotional service of the Lord. By reviving one's eternal spiritual body, one can understand oneself to be a minute particle of the spiritual potency of the Lord. In other words, the living entity is a minute particle of eternity, bliss, and omniscience. And thus, in full Krishna consciousness, there's no possibility of his being carried away by the illusion of the three modes of nature. In conclusion, it may be stated that the individual living entity is never actually entangled in matter and is thus not liberated, although his illusory state may be accurately described as entangled and liberated. On the other hand, the Supreme Personality Godhead is eternally situated in his own spiritual potencies and can never be described as being bound up, and thus there's no meaning to the concept of the Lord's freeing himself from such a non-existent condition. It's philosophy and terminology. So it's good to get the terminology clear. Condition, not condition. Liberated, not liberated. Okay, so we're going to some nice visuals. Here's one. There's a bird in a bird cage, and he's looking at Krishna, the bird. The Supreme Personality Godhead said, my dear Uddhava, due to the influence of the material modes of nature, which are under my control, the living entity is sometimes designated as conditioned and sometimes is liberated. In fact, however, the soul is never really bound up or liberated. And since I am the Supreme Lord of Maya, which is the cause of the modes of nature, I am never to be considered liberated or in bondage. So that's a nice summary of what we heard. Living entity is, you can say both, and for the Supreme Lord, you can't say either. Another interesting graphic here. The living entity imagines a false connection with the three modes of nature and accepts the material body as the self. The living entity therefore suffers the consequences of his own imagination, just as one suffers the illusory activities of a dream. Where does she come up with these graphics? And another very interesting image here. Although the individual soul is never actually bound to matter, he suffers the reactions of material nature because of false identification, and thus the term baddha, or bound up, may be used to indicate the nature of a living entity's experience within the inferior energy of the Lord. Very amazing graphic. So we are not there yet as far as getting a comprehensive response to Uddhava's question from the end of chapter 11, the end of chapter 10. But the foundation is being laid. Let's say so far it's not just we're not the body, because that's certainly a core understanding, Bhagavad Gita, then developing it further. But as spirit soul, there is no actual factual connection with the covering. So we're not, one side says, we're not actually conditioned or liberated because we have nothing to do with either, because it's just a covering. It's not us. But then on the other hand, one can say, based upon the experience of the living entity through the agency of false ego identifying with that which one is not, then one can say the state of existence temporarily can be conditioned or liberated. And so one can affix Nityabhata Nityasiddha, and then the magic wand hits the Nityabhata living entity and he can become Nityasiddha. Which sounds like a contradiction, because if it's Nityasiddha, it's Nityasiddha. Nitya means Nitya. So that's a third complication, which we're going to hear some more about, I'm sure. Anadi Bahirmukha. We heard that. This is a Krishnadas Kaviraj phrase that was referred to yesterday. And Anadi. Adi means beginning, and Anadi means without beginning. Anadi Bahirmukh. That's the conditioned, one's face or mukh turned away from Krishna, or it's translated as forgetfulness of Krishna. Anadi, how long has it been since that happened? There's two ways of looking at the word anadi. Absolutely, absolutely eternally conditioned. Or anadi can mean so far back in time you can't estimate when it happened. Just leave it at, anadi bahirmukh. So that's the Nityas Baddha. But listen, let's apply that understanding to what we're hearing. The soul is eternally connected to Krishna. So how can the soul that's eternally connected to Krishna be covered when in fact they're not? Because they're eternally part and parcel of Krishna. So then it lends the question, well, what's the covering? What is this ignorance? What's Maya in relation to the source of everything? I mean, this is Sambandha again, all over again, in a deeper probe into what's going on. In a more significant sense, one thing that we hear kind of regularly is the Vedas have abundant information how to get out. They don't have abundant information how we got in this condition. But the logic is, if you understand how you got in, you can understand how to get out. There's a sign on the front door here that says, use the side door. So we'll assume that you came through the side door. And that's a way to get out. Now, there's two ways. There's a front door and a side door. But you have to go through the door. I guess you could, jump through the window or something. But by logic, how one enters tells how one can exit. So the entrance is bahirmukha. Now, leaving aside the when, there's the how. And the how is bahirmukha. Forgetfully, the translation from, it's Krishnadas Kaviraj's words. It's forgetfulness of Krishna. That's ignorance. Forgetting Krishna, that's the primordial ignorance. And the restoring of knowledge is the primordial returning attention to Krishna. Easier said than done, because we're lazy and we're conditioned. So we kind of, but kind of don't. And so we're kind of in between. To be continued. See if there's some discussion. Over here.
Guru Maharaj, first I want to make sure that I understood correctly, because this verse is kind of, first I started to get confused.
It's kind of how you makes you confused.
Like, the conditioned and then eternally liberated.
Okay,
and it's
go
not
ahead.
conditioned,
Let's
something
hear
like,
it.
But so after going through all this text and everything, so my understanding is it's just an imagination that the soul is not really baddha or liberated, but that it imagines that it's been conditioned with this, identified with this body, senses and mind. So that is what...
If you to unbewilder yourself,
Okay.
you can go back to the concluding summary that we just read.
Mm.
In conclusion, or in summary, and it summarizes it very nicely.
Yeah.
You want me to read it again? Or you read it again?
Yeah, that's what I kind of coming to that point.
Okay, let's go to that point.
So it's kind of just an imagination that the soul thinks it's been identified with this thing. I'm conditioned.
Well, it's like a dream is imagination, but let's be careful to clarify. Imagination doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because it exists within the mind.
Mm.
It exists. It's not false. It exists. But it's a very particular kind of existence. It's an imaginary existence.
Mm.
And therefore one can say we are liberated, or we're conditioned. And one can say someone becomes liberated. And it's describing the condition of that soul, the superimposition upon the soul, that upadhi, conditioned, liberated. It's a designation or an upadhi. But the soul, on the other hand, the soul is neither liberated or conditioned.
Okay.
It never becomes liberated or is conditioned. But his soul is always liberated. So one can, depending upon the vantage point, the perspective, one can say either. So one can make an argument for this, one can make an argument for that, and be in an endless debate, because this and that. Or you can step back and say both are correct. Depends on your vantage point. Is that clear?
Yes, Maharaj.
Okay.
So if I say, but now I know that I'm not really conditioned, and with this information, as a knowledge.
Depends.
So
on
when
the
I talk, or when I talk to somebody, I'll say that I'm conditioned. But is it okay to say that with that idea of because I'm conditioned to this life, my mind, and with the other things going?
Yes.
Okay.
Think of what's being presented here in terms of the Brahma-bhuta verse of Bhagavad Gita. The Brahma-bhuta verse of Bhagavad Gita is what's being described here.
Mm.
Na sochati, that prasanatma, na sochati, na kangsati, samak sarveshu bhuteshu. Those are three characteristics in sequence. And then mad bhaktim labhate param. So it's knowledge that liberates the soul from illusion. And when illusion is gone, then one's situated in knowledge. What does that look like? What are the symptoms? There's three. Prasanatma, nasochati nakangsati, samak sarveshu. Maybe you remember from the class with the Chinese devotees, one of those devotees, Kamalamurti, asked, we want to keep good association, avoid bad association. How do we distinguish between the two? Remember that question? Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about the question. It's, we want the association of liberated souls. At least we want the association of those who are striving, not just for liberation, but striving for bhakti. But if you're striving for bhakti, then you got your hands on the steering wheel. That is, you're guided by knowledge. Not just, I want to please Krishna, and there's no guidance of knowledge. There's guidance of knowledge. Knowledge, minimally, here's the category of matter, here's the category of spirit. We belong to the category of spirit. And when it understands that properly, then you understand matter also belongs to Krishna. I and you and the separated material energy were all parts of, were extensions of Krishna's energy meant for his service. That's the bhakti principle of knowledge. And so one who cultivates a life like that, that's good association. And one who has matured in that is liberated. It's a designation. But the symptoms of that designation is nasochati, nakangsati. So you see sochati and kangsati, then there's a soul that's actually eternally part of Krishna, not Buddha, but behaving like one. The behavior is not the soul. The behavior of sochati and kangsati is not the soul. And samak friends and enemies. Samak sarveshu bhuteshu. Seeing friends and enemies. That's the behavior of a conditioned soul. But the soul is not neither liberated or conditioned. So we don't have really any friends or enemies. We don't have really any. But we feel it. So how to navigate our way through conditioned life while we're conditioned, move towards the liberated. That's what this chapter is. That's the question. And that's the answer in the whole chapter. The practical. And then anyway, it goes on, how to practically regard the super soul, who's neither liberated or conditioned at any point. We are. So that's, now back to your question. Are you wanting to probe on this further, or you're okay?
Yeah, yes, Maharaj. Just on clarification, it says eternally conditioned and eternally liberated. It's
as liberated to conditioned. So eternally liberated and eternally conditioned have their different ways of looking at it. There's the absolute way, and that means the absolute way is, look, if a living entity is eternally conditioned, no question of becoming liberated, because they're eternally conditioned. But then here the language comes out of a box and says, nope, he just became not just liberated, but eternally liberated. Well, wait a minute, that's a contradiction. Wait a minute. You can't say became eternally liberated. So why are you saying he becomes eternally? It's right here. It's going to be discussed further. We're just touching our big toe in the water to see what the water feels like. It'll be expanded as we go along. I'd rather rely on what the expansion that Krishna is going to be very thorough here. So let's let him do and we'll follow.
Okay. Thank you, Maharaj.
In the corner back there.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. This is an appreciation. This section seems very powerful and relatable, and gives lot of tools helps to check on myself. And these two graphics you showed in the last was very relatable, and felt like it gives a solace that being understood, because time to time I struggle. I don't know which part of me is real. because from jumping from this place to this, or where from I'm acting or reacting. So that was very heart touching for me.
Good.
So thank you, Guru Maharaj.
Well, the graphic credit goes to the graphic artist. She invested a lot of meditation, and where she came up with the graphics, I have no idea. I've not asked her, but wherever she gets it, it's fantastic. And she's working on the next chapter until her marriage. And then she'll work on the rest. Okay. Anything else in the room? Yes.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. I was remembering this quote when we were discussing that we are not the human beings having spiritual experience, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
That's it.
I was connecting to the eternally conditioned and eternally liberated as an experience. So if we experience with the illusory energy, that we are conditioned. So it's based on experience in one sense.
Very well spoken.
I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Yeah. Over here.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. Maharaj, I think somewhere in the chapter summary, there was a statement that if someone comes in contact with the devotees of the Lord, they're considered perfect. And
Whoa.
Or,
It doesn't say quite like that. They get bhakti.
okay,
I mean, we've had contact and we're not perfect.
exactly.
That's your question.
Yes,
Okay.
it sounded like a conflict.
It's a path for perfection, but it's not perfection yet. Okay, we're ready for online.
So, Neha Mataji is asking, in Canto 1 read that Romaharshan was killed by Lord Balaram because he did not stand when Balaram came in the assembly where he was reciting the Puranas. But on the other hand, when he appeared as Lord Nityananda, even after insulted and hit by Jahai Madai, still did not kill them. First case seems to be rude of him. How to understand this?
Different mood. Same person, different mood. We all have different moods. And his mission with Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was not to kill demons, but to kill the demoniac mentality and spirit. So he was really good at it, Lord Nityananda. So it's just a different mood. That's how to understand it.
Okay. The second question from Narayan Prabhu. Guru Maharaj, Vedas do not have bundle of information. How we got it? Could you please elaborate on this?
Could you say it in different language what his question is? How did we get knowledge and when other people don't have it? That's the question?
He says Vedas do not have bundle of information.
Vedas do.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
So the premise is not
He's asking how we got it. Something like that.
how we got it. Well, we got it from those who got it. We got it in disciplic succession. And the Vedas do, or the Vedic literature is filled with understandings and information. And some portions of it are absolutely transcendental in their, the sound vibration and their message. So we got it because there are persons that got it. In our case, it's Brahma. And through disciplic succession, we got it. Next.
It's from Amara Mataji. Maharaj, some people experience out of body experiences and their life transforms for good with this realization. Although they may not be following any process of self-realization, how can we understand this? It's a two-part question.
Well, Krishna is not bound by, he's got some rules he's got to follow, and he only follows the rules that he's bound by. Some great souls can have, not remember, and some ordinary souls can remember. No, there may be some reason behind Krishna's giving out-of-body experiences to some and not to others. I don't know what considerations Krishna is making, but he's a person, and he doesn't even need a reason. But if there's some consideration made by him, you have to ask him. But it's causeless. That's the nature of causeless. Go ahead.
Second one, in the spiritual world, there is no effect of modes of nature. I am trying to understand how the demons with bad qualities appear in such world.
How demons do what?
Have bad qualities. With bad qualities, they appear there.
Because here's a place of bad qualities.
It says, the question starts is, in the spiritual world, there's no
demons.
Yeah, okay.
Or there's a sense of demons. And there's a school of devotees, elevated devotees, not just speculative devotees, that have an argument that says, for Krishna's pleasure, there are demons in the spiritual world, which would mean that they're not really demons. But anyway, it's an interesting, that's exceptional. The standard rule, the standard contemplation or understanding is, as there's no modes of nature in the spiritual world, there's no demons, because demon means influenced by the modes and false ego. Go ahead.
The last question is from Uttama Bhakta Prabhu. Is term liberated or eternally bound being used in relative terms, not absolute terms? Is that correct?
Not which?
He's asking, is that used in relative terms, not absolute, right?
Not absolute?
Absolute terms, yeah.
Okay, your pronunciation is a little difficult for me.
Okay.
Absolute terms. Got it. Okay. Yeah, that's another way of saying what we've been discussing. I mean, what Bhaktisiddhanta and the BBT commentary is saying. That's another way of what you said is another way of saying the same thing. Yes.
That's it.
Okay. Prabhupada ki